Another good story. Stories are one of my favorite hobbies. So today, I'm going to tell you a story about a man named Nehemiah. Now, there are three themes in this story that I want you to pay particular attention to. Leadership, facing opposition, and reformation. If you can pay attention to these three themes, you will gain much from this story. But before I can give you the story itself, I need to give you the backstory, the history. So in 588 BC, or thereabouts, Jerusalem was razed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And Jerusalem's people were taken into exile, and its temple and walls were destroyed. Then around the year 539 BC, the kingdoms of Media and Persia conquered Babylon, and the following year, King Cyrus of Persia allowed the exiles to return and rebuild the temple. Despite opposition, they rebuilt the temple at around the year 515 BC. And then around the year 458 BC, Ezra the scholar, restored the priesthood and the regular sacrifices in Jerusalem with the blessings of King Artaxerxes of Persia. However, despite all this good progress, there was still something that was left unfinished. Sometime between 464 and 446 BC, the nation surrounding Jerusalem became wary about how Jerusalem was rebuilding its walls. And so they sent an appeal to King Artaxerxes of Persia, claiming that if the walls were rebuilt, then Jerusalem would revolt. And Artaxerxes replied in Ezra chapter 4, verses 21 to 22, "Now issue an order to these men to stop work, so that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests?" This is where Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, comes in. And Nehemiah was a Jew living in Susa, one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. And it was around the year 446 BC that Nehemiah's brother Hanani came to him with news from Jerusalem in Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 3 to 4. "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When Nehemiah heard these things, he sat down and wept. For some days he mourned and fasted and prayed to the God of heaven. Nehemiah saw with painful clarity how incomplete God's work was. And his heart was moved. And his first response was to pray. Nehemiah's prayer involved the confession of sins, both his own and those of the people around him. "I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you." His prayer acknowledged the need for reform. His prayer also claimed the promises of God to restore his people. And in Nehemiah chapter 11, he prayed for God's providence. "Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man." Nehemiah was a man of prayer, but also a man of action. Now, this man that Nehemiah is referring to was the emperor, or the king. And Nehemiah was in a very special position, for Nehemiah was the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes of Persia. The cupbearer means that Nehemiah had the responsibility and was trusted to test the king's drink for poison and then deliver the drink to the king. About the only person closer to the king would be the queen. So Nehemiah chapter 2, we have Nehemiah record in his own words that sometime about 4 months later, when he was serving the king, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take? And when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. Nehemiah also asked for official letters, asking for safe passage and supplies to rebuild the walls. And because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. In fact, the king went further. Nehemiah was made the governor of Judah. It is as Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, verse 7, "Ask and it will be given to you." Note Nehemiah's silent prayer to God. Note Nehemiah's tact in approaching the emperor, the same king who had ordered the walls to stop being rebuilt. Note the evidence of Nehemiah's planning, for when the king asked him, Nehemiah knew exactly what he needed to fulfill the work. Note also how Nehemiah seized the opportunity when he saw it. He did not dither. He did not shy away from responsibility. He saw that God had opened a path, and he trusted that God would bring him through it. So Nehemiah went to Jerusalem, and when he got there, he was not hasty in starting the work. Instead, he took the time and the care to properly investigate the situation in Jerusalem, to assess exactly what work needed to be done. And only after he had made his assessment did he gather together the leaders and the priests and all the other people. In Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 17 to 18, "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. Nehemiah now had a colossal task ahead of him? Was this something that he would do alone? Or perhaps something in which he'd appoint a small committee to do all the work? No. This was something in which everyone was to be involved. Nehemiah chapter 3 describes in detail who was involved in the work and what their contributions were. We see that rebuilding the wall, we had the high priest, goldsmiths, a perfume maker, priests, district rulers, men and women, merchants, servants, and lay people. All sorts of people from all levels of society contributed to this good work. Many of these people probably had no special talent in construction, but that didn't matter. God equips the called. God equips the called. He does not necessarily call the equipped. All God asks is that we have the faith to follow when he calls. But not everyone did the work assigned to them, as we read in Nehemiah 3 verse 5. Next to them the Tekoites made repairs, but their nobles did not put their shoulders to the work of their Lord. Just as the willingness of everyone else to contribute was recorded, so was the unwillingness of the Tekoite nobles recorded. This is not a trivial matter. As we read in Revelation 20 verse 12, the dead will be judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books. And it's also as we read in the parable of the talents, where the servants who did the work with what they had been given were rewarded, or the servant who did no work was punished. God does not take kindly to those who ignore the work he gives them. I would not want to be the Tekoite nobles on the day of judgment, for they'll have a fair bit to answer for. But the work God gives us is not necessarily onerous. As Jesus said in Matthew 11 verse 30, "For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." For many of the people rebuilding the walls, their allocated portion was right next to their homes. Often, the work God has for us is local. It is within our own families, our homes, our communities, our workplaces, our schools. It does not matter how close or far the work is. It only matters that we do it. However, the work of God rarely carries on without opposition from the enemy. Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 19 records, "When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. 'What is this you are doing?' they asked. 'Are you rebelling against the king?' Remember these three characters. We have Sanballat, who was governor of Samaria, north of Jerusalem. We have Tobiah, governor of Transjordan, east of Jerusalem. And we have Geshem, governor of the Arabian coalition, south of Jerusalem. These three people were Nehemiah's main political opponents. Of particular note is Tobiah. His name translates to "the Lord is good," which implies that Tobiah also worshipped the Lord Jehovah. Tobiah was also very influential among the Jews, as is written in Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 17 to 19. In those days, the nobles of Judah kept sending letters were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds and then telling him what I'd said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. Tobiah did some good things. He was a generally respected member of the community. But he abused his position and his power for his own personal gain rather than for the work of the Lord. However, Nehemiah was not afraid of these people. He says in chapter 2, verse 20, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it." Nehemiah trusted in God's strength. For if God is with us, who can be against us? Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 1 to 3 records, "When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, 'What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?' Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, 'What they are building, if even a fox climbed up on it, he would break down their wall of stones.' They scoffed and insulted the Israelites who were doing God's work. This is not unique to Nehemiah's time. As is written in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3, "You must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires." So what are we to do about the scoffers of our time? Well, what did Nehemiah do? He did not deliver scathing retorts. He did not insult them back, not publicly at least. He did not begin a war of words. Rather, Nehemiah left judgment to God. He prayed about it. And he resiliently carried on the work. Then in Nehemiah 4, verses 8 to 9, "They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat." Nehemiah's response to this growing threat from his enemies was prayer and watchfulness, or in other words, faith and actions. Both are required. Now it came to the point that the work was half done. But the workers were getting discouraged and afraid. The builders were tiring, and their enemies were threatening to kill them. The challenges appeared insurmountable. If they relied on human strength alone, they would surely fail. But Nehemiah was not deterred. To guard against his enemies, he stationed guards across the wall day and night. And then in chapter 4, verses 14 to 15, "After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, 'Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes.' And when our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot, and God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to his own work. As a leader, Nehemiah showed courage and provided encouragement to his people. Nehemiah leaned on God, and he led others to do the same. And because of that, they pulled through the trials. Now, Nehemiah, as a leader, was a special target of his enemies' attacks. In Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 2 to 3, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message: "Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono." But they were scheming to harm me, so I sent messengers to them with this reply: "I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you?" Nehemiah knew his task and would not be deterred or distracted from it. So when that failed, Sanballat relied on blackmail. He sent an open letter such that all could read it. And it read in verses 6 to 8. "It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it is true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are rebuilding the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem: 'There is a king in Judah.' Now, this report will get back to the king. So come, let us confer together." I sent him this reply: "Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head." Nehemiah was not afraid of his enemies' lies because he knew that he was in the right. It is as 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 12 says, "Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." This is why it is so critical that leaders glorify God and not themselves. Because when leaders do seek to glorify themselves first, then they undermine not just themselves, but all of God's people. Well, you've seen in the recent news stories of prominent people in various churches who have used their power for their own personal gain, most notably via sexual abuse. And these corrupt church officials have severely damaged the reputation of the church and the rest of God's people. This is why 1 Timothy chapter 3 verses 2 and 7 advises us. "Now the overseer must be above reproach. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap." Now Nehemiah did more than just face against opposition. He also led the work by example. For instance, in Nehemiah chapter 4 verse 23, when guards were stationed across the walls of Jerusalem, "Neither I, nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when he went for water." Nehemiah did not stand back and let everyone else do the work. Rather, he got in there, he got his hands dirty. He set an example he would not do anything. He did not ask anyone to do anything that he himself was not willing to do. And in this way, he led the people of Jerusalem. Now, we might be inclined to think that Nehemiah must have been some kind of superhuman, an extraordinary person, that we could never possibly live up to his example. But I tell you that the truth is that what Nehemiah did, we can do also. But not by our own strength. In Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 9, they were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. This is Nehemiah's secret. He prayed. He prayed when he heard of the ruin in Jerusalem. He prayed when he appealed to the king. He prayed when the governors mocked and threatened him. He prayed for God to be with him in all that he did. He prayed for everything. In Philippians 4 verse 6 it says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And in Ephesians chapter 6 verse 18 it says, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the saints. Prayer is our connection with God. And as long as that connection stays strong, we will endure anything the world can throw at us. Now, despite the opposition, and because of the great faithfulness of everyone involved, the wall was completed in 52 days. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God, as written in Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 15 and 16. When God's people set their minds to his mission, incredible things can happen. Now, you might be inclined to think that the wall's rebuilt, so the job's done. Everyone can go home, nothing more to do. But in truth, the work of reformation is never really done. They'd rebuilt the wall, but they still needed to rebuild their relationships with each other and with God. One of the issues Nehemiah faced, even during the rebuilding of the wall, was economic exploitation and hardship. In Nehemiah chapter 5, we see that there was a famine on the land. The poor were forced to sell off their land, their homes, even their own children into slavery, just to survive. And the rich, rather than helping their fellow believers, they exploited them for their own personal gain. This is contrary to what Deuteronomy 15 verses 7 to 8 tells us. If there is a poor man among your brothers, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards your brother. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend him whatever he needs. And we also see in Acts that the early Christian church was very big on acts of charity and helping those who needed the help. God expects us to use our wealth for his glory, not our own. Nehemiah 5, verses 6 to 7. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind, and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, you are exacting usury from your own countrymen. Nehemiah was rightfully angry at this injustice. He carefully thought through the situation, considered what the best course of action was to be. And then he went and confronted those who were the offenders. And he made them promise to reform, to help the needy in this case. And he led by example in this, in using his own wealth to help the other Israelites. This was only the start of Nehemiah's reforms, though. The next step came in chapter 8. All the people assembled as one man in the square before the water gate. They told Ezra the scribe to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. So on the first day of the 7th month, Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, which was made up of men and women and all who would understand. He read it aloud from daybreak till noon as he faced the square before the water gate in the presence of the men, women, and others who could understand. And all the people listened attentively to the book of the law. The Levites instructed the people in the law while the people were standing there. They read from the book of the law of God, making it clear and giving the meaning so that the people could understand what was being read. The core element of any reformation is the Bible. As 2 Timothy chapter 3 verses 16 and 17 says, all scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. Note that here in Nehemiah, men and women and children, everyone was taught the Bible. And they were taught it in such a way that they could comprehend it. All were to know the Word of God, so that they could all apply it to their own lives. However, a special responsibility was placed upon the leaders in Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 13. On the second day of the month, that is, the next day, the heads of all the families, along with the priests and Levites, gathered around Ezra the scribe to give attention to the words of the law. Leaders are to lead by example, and so they must know God's word so that they know which example to give. True reformation is rooted in the Bible. But it's more than just an intellectual understanding of the Bible that is needed. It also needs to be accompanied by a commitment to change. That's what it means to reform in the literal sense of the word. In Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 1 to 3, on the 24th day of the same month, the Israelites gathered together, fasting and wearing sackcloth and having dust on their heads. Those of Israelite descent had separated themselves from all foreigners. They stood in their places and confessed their sins and the wickedness of their fathers. They stood where they were and read from the book of the law of the Lord their God for a quarter of the day, and spent another quarter in confession and in worshipping the Lord their God. This mirrors the start of the book of Nehemiah, where the people here are praying and confessing their sins and asking for forgiveness. The Israelites committed to numerous changes and reforms. They promised not to intermarry with pagan foreigners, a safeguard against worldly influence. They promised to keep the Sabbath. They promised to return their tithes and offerings for all the duties of the house of our God, as in Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 33. God wants us to use our wealth to support his mission. Now you might be inclined to think that the job is done. The walls are rebuilt. People have committed to changes. They've had their little evangelistic Bible seminar series. All is good. Job's done. You can go home. No more to do. The work of reformation is never really done. It's not something which you can do at just one point in time and then forget about it. You have to follow it up. Now, around 433 BC, Nehemiah was called away from Jerusalem back to Persia. Some years later, Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem, and he discovered that it had succumbed to backsliding, complacency, and worldly influence. We see in Nehemiah chapter 13 that temple rooms, which were meant to be allocated for the holy instruments of God and for the offerings, had instead been given to Tobiah for personal use. No one was returning their tithes and offerings, so the temple workers had left the job and gone to their own homes. People were trading and working on the Sabbath. And people had intermarried with foreigners and were not raising their children in the way of the Lord their God. It was almost as if Nehemiah's reforms had been completely forgotten. This is why it is important to follow up any reformation and guard against backsliding. On the temple rooms in verses 8 and 9, I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God, with the grain offerings and the incense. On the other misdeeds of the Israelites, Nehemiah gave them stern rebukes, especially to the leaders who were meant to be setting an example for people to follow. He reminded them why they had made the commitments to change in the first place, and he renewed their commitments. And on the matter of the offerings, in verses 11 to 13, I rebuked the officials and asked them, "Why is the house of God neglected?" Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. All Judah brought the tithes into the storerooms. I put Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan son of Zaccur the son of Mattaniah their assistant, because these men were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their brothers. Note how Nehemiah delegates here. He found trustworthy people to do some of the work, because even a great leader like Nehemiah cannot do everything himself. It is similar to how we read in Acts chapter 6 of the 12 apostles appointing 7 deacons to manage the church finances. A good leader appoints other leaders to rule over their own spheres, because a good leader knows that a good team is invaluable. And that is the story of Nehemiah. And in it we have learned much about leadership, opposition, and reformation. We have learned that a leader must be prayerful. They must lead by example. They must be focused on the goal and have a vision for where they want to take God's people. They must work for God's glory and not their own. And they need to be able to delegate when needed. We have learned that when facing opposition, that we need to be prayerful. We need to rely on God's strength. And we need to focus on the mission. And we have learned that a true reformation contains prayer, repentance, self-reflection, Bible study, a commitment to change, and vigilance against backsliding complacency and worldly influence. I leave you today with this one prayer from Nehemiah, one of many of his prayers. One which applies to all of God's faithful servants. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. Thank you.